Hey, welcome to this programming user interface lecture. Today we're going to talk about JavaScript libraries and how to implement them and how to start using them. So a JavaScript library is similar to how we discussed CSS libraries, where it's basically a external file or external set of JavaScript files that add additional functionality to your project or your site, right? And so these JavaScript libraries have been written by somebody else, some developer, and they've usually been released as open source, so you can include them in your project to add more complex things to your project, to your site. So similar to CSS libraries, they kind of come with their own instructions, right? And so the key to using JavaScript libraries is understanding how to actually use the JavaScript libraries and how to interact with it in the way that they document it. So it's a little different from kind of the standardized vanilla JavaScript we've been doing, where it's like basically the same everywhere. Like get element by ID is the same across all browsers. So a JavaScript library usually has its own kind of set of rules of how you need to interact with it and use it. And there's tons of these libraries that are around and very useful for various things, from visualizations to data manipulation to all sorts of stuff, right? So the way we're going to approach this is just go through a couple of different libraries and kind of get some experience with them. And the first library we're going to look at is a library called jQuery. And so this library has been around for a very long time, and it was like kind of a very useful and very kind of critical library in the early days of web development, because it basically provided a way of smoothing over all the differences around different browsers, right? So in the old days, you had like Internet Explorer that did things a certain way, and then you had Mozilla Firefox that had something a little bit different, and etc. So what jQuery did was kind of provide a single API or interface to those different browsers, and that provided one kind of approach to doing the same thing across many browsers. So basically, it was a library that kind of simplified web development and simplified doing things in JavaScript across different types of browsers. So it's not really as needed as it was back in those days, because most browsers have been aligned, right? So all the same kind of ways of doing things in JavaScript have been unified. So if you do something in Firefox, it's the same way as in Chrome, the same way as in IE Edge or something like that. So, but you'll still come across it. So we're going to talk a little bit about it, because if you have to if you have to maintain a site, or you found some kind of library that uses jQuery, it's good to know about it, and it's so ubiquitous. It's out there everywhere, so it's good to have some knowledge about it. To get started with it, it's kind of interesting. jQuery stores itself, right? So this is an external library that kind of loads itself into your script, into your site, and it stores itself in this $sign variable, which is a little strange. But basically, a variable can be anything, right? Any series of letters, numbers, and even in this case, this $sign character is a valid variable, so it stores itself in that variable. And so honestly, actually, if you go to like a lot of sites, you can usually pick like a random site, and so let's say we'll go to Pratt's site, and you open up the console, and you just put in the $sign, hit enter. You'll see this kind of function return, right? And this is basically jQuery being initialized. And if you clicked on that and you went to the source code files, you'd see there's jQuery being loaded. So you'll find that jQuery is being included on a lot of sites, and it's actually pretty ubiquitous. And so that this is the same idea, where it's kind of weird that this is stored in the $sign, where you define a variable, right? It's the same idea with jQuery. You could say var this equals, and then all this blah 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 stuff that is the actual library. It has all these features and methods and stuff built into it. So the $sign is just basically a shorthand to invoke jQuery. And so the thing that we need to know about jQuery is it's really based around selecting elements of the DOM. And so, for example, it uses the same CSS notation as CSS. So it's £, dots for classes. You can string together children to get a specific element that's a child of another element. And so basically, you're going to see mostly jQuery being evoked with this $sign and then parentheses and then the CSS selector for the item you want to select, right? And so in this case, in this example here, we're selecting for a element called container that has an ID of container, right? Because the $sign means ID. And it's basically selecting that, whatever it is. It could be a div, it could be a button, it could be something. It's probably a div. And it's then setting the text of that element to hello world, right? And you can actually train these things together to do multiple activities. So in the second one example, it's locating the container div, and then it's appending a new element, and it's basically creating a new element from scratch using this jQuery quote bracket the element, and then it's setting the text of that element. So it's a little bit different kind of stringing these things together, but we'll go over that. And also, this is very similar to if you're going to do this in vanilla JavaScript as saying like, document get element by ID container, right? But in this case, there's no individual methods for each one. It's just one kind of approach, and you're just selecting it by the CSS selector. So to kind of give some examples of this, we're going to do an activity using a glitch and some challenges here. And so basically this glitch has a number of divs that basically are little activities for each one. So some of these are like, the first one, we're going to try to add a span to this div using jQuery, which is a very common activity. We know how to do that with vanilla JavaScript. This one, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it when you click on this button. So it's basically, kind of an event listener type activity. And then we're going to try to change the background, so how to modify the CSS or the style elements. And then we're going to do how to use jQuery to download JSON from a server and do something with it. So the first thing that we want to do is remix this, right? And so again, like, if you really need to evaluate if you'd want to use jQuery for something, you might really like the basically the way that it's implements its API. So you might think, well, this is really useful. Or you might be like, well, I'm very comfortable with the vanilla JavaScript and I don't really need to do anything too complicated in this project, so I won't need to use jQuery. But for all these libraries, the first thing you need to do is figure out how to get it into your project, into your site, right? So jQuery, we're just going to search jQuery download. And so we've done this before with CSS files and many times, right? And so basically, the site, the library projects or the project site will offer you a couple of ways of including the site or including the library. The first one will be you can just download it, right? A JavaScript file. It'll just be a single JS file, and you can include it in your project. So usually they offer it as like two different modes, right? Here's the compressed minified version of it, which is it's taken the full version of it and like run it through some algorithms to like make everything very short and removes all the white space to make it as small as possible. And then another version is just the full version, which is traditional JavaScript looking. So it really depends on if this is gonna be a production release, you'd probably use a production version of it. If you're doing development, you might want to use the more verbose one. But for us, when we get started, we're probably not going to be looking at the source code of the library that much because it's pretty static, right? You're not going to change that ever at all. But mostly be looking at the documentation to understand how to use it. But the first thing that we're going to do is get this included. So we can either download this, or there's also a usually they offer a CDN if it's a big enough library that's very popular. We talked about the CDN's options before, but basically a CDN is Content Delivery Network, and it's just a high bandwidth, very massive distributed distribution network. So it's basically web servers that are run by very large organizations. So for example, Google offers a CDN for these jQuery files. And the reason you'd use a CDN is that the idea is that if everyone uses CDN, then if someone goes to another site and that uses the same CDN as me, then once they get to my site, they already have that file in their cache, right? Because browser caches things, and if it's the same URL, then it's going to cache that same file and include it in their cache. So if everyone used the same Google CDN for jQuery, then you would only have to download it once, and then it'd be, everyone would have it included in their cache. Um, the downside of that, of course, is that you're dependent on Google to actually serving this file for you. And if it was required for your site, then it could break your site, right? If it's not working. So in 3 years, if Google says, we're not going to support this anymore and turn it off, then, you'd have to go back and fix a 3-year-old site that you are depending on them to have their CDN working. So that said, we are going to use a CDN just first for ease of use. And so when you include it, right, you just want to make sure you include it into your head element. And of course, you just want to make sure the order of operations is right. So if you were going to use some external scripts for your own stuff, like this external JavaScript script, ours is empty. But if you did use it, you'd want to make sure that it appears after, right, the jQuery include, so that it's actually available once you want to use it in your own script. We're going to be doing all of our script in line here, so we don't necessarily need to do that. We actually don't even need this, right? So let's delete this. All right, so we have basically we have for each one of these, let's look at this. We have a div, and then instructions, and then a link to the documentation. And so this is really key for understanding how to do stuff with libraries, is you have to read the documentation and understand how that library wants you to do a certain thing, right? And so this is not like the vanilla JavaScript where everything is the same, where you learn it once. For each library, you might have different ways of doing something. And so there might be kind of similar patterns, but still have to read the documentation to see what are the special keywords, right? What are the reserved words that do what you want it to do? All right, so for the first example here, we say we want to try to add a span to the div on this page with the div1 using jQuery. So the first thing we need to do is create a div and then add it to, or create a span and add it to this div. And so if we're going to do this in vanilla JavaScript, we could say, okay, we probably first use get element by ID to get the div, and then we would use create element to create the span, and then we use append child to add it to the div. Or we would set the inner HTML of the div to the span. So similarly, here's a link to the documentation for jQuery and how to do this. Similarly to vanilla JavaScript, jQuery has an append method. And so basically it says, you append it to the content of the thing you search for. And so they give an example here. Append. So this is selecting anything that has an inner class, right, because of the period, and then it appends this block of HTML to it. Another way of doing it is actually creating a new element and then appending it to the thing you're selecting. So you can create an element in this format. So let's try it. So we know that our div that we're searching for is called div1. That has an ID of div1. So the first thing we're going to do is select it. Make sure that pound sign there, right? So we selected the div, and then we're going to append something. So we can append just arbitrary HTML like this. And if we looked at the results, we'd see it appended it, right? Because it started, as soon as the page loaded, it ran that script, so it just appended it immediately. Another way of doing this is via documentation, is that you can say, okay, you know what? First, I want you to create a new span. And if we just ran this, we could go see, if we inspected, there should be an empty span in here. Yeah, there's the empty span. And then we can chain these things together and say, and also set the text of this, right? Not the inner HTML, just the text. Set the text of this to, right? So if you think about math, the order of operations, it does this stuff in the parentheses first. And between these things, it does this on the left first. And then it does this, set the text. And then it takes the result of all this, which is a span with a text hello, and then adds it to div1. So we can see there it is. So if this is a little confusing as far as like nesting these operations together and chaining them together, this is basically the same as saying like this: var my div or my span equals create a new span. So we're creating a new span here and storing the results in my span. And we could say my span dot text and set that to right. And then the last thing we're gonna do is add it to the page, add it to that div. It's the same result. So you know, if you have it kind of all nested together, it's very succinct and kind of very nice to quickly do stuff. If you needed a reference to it later, this might be an option to store it in a variable so you could do stuff with it later. But if you're just building like HTML structures, it's pretty easy just to nest it and just be done with it. All right, so that covers the first one. The next one we want to do is do the same thing, but only when we click on this button. And so if we look at the documentation, there of course is another on method, so built into jQuery. And so they're saying if you want to use jQuery to add an event to something, you just basically say, okay, you select what you want to add it to, and you say on, and then you set the event you want it to trigger, and then you pass the function. So this is very similar to our add event listener, right? So let's copy that and just add it to our own code. All right, so here's our div2 ID. Here's our div2 button with the ID div2 button. And so we're gonna paste this here. And we're gonna change the selector, right? Because we're not selecting the example. We're gonna select for the div2 button. We wanna make sure we put a pound sign. And we do want to do a click event. And then though we don't want to do this example, we actually want to add a new span to the div. So we'll do the same thing we did last time. We'll say, okay, find that div. This time it's div2. Make sure you put the pound sign. So first find that div2, then we're going to append something to it. And what we're going to append? We're going to append creating a new element called span inside. And we're going to set the text of that once it's created to hello. So you can see why people, enjoy using jQuery, because it's very succinct, right? In just 2 lines of code, basically, you can make a click event and add a new event listener to add a new element to an existing element. So it's very, very succinct, very quick. It speeds up development a lot, right? All right, so let's try see if it works. So when I click, there it is. Hello, hello, hello. There it goes off the page. All right. So yeah, so you can add other events, right? Any event that the browser supports, things like key presses, things like mouse overs, things like hovers, things like mouse enter, mouse leave, all those events that are supported by the standards you can bind to. All right, the next one says we want to try to change the background color of the div on this page with div3 using jQuery. So let's look at the documentation. And so basically, jQuery provides a .css method built into it. And so if we look at, for examples here, we just want to see some examples of how it's being used. Oh, here's a good example. So it's just saying .css, the property you want to change, and then the value you want to change it to, separated by commas. So if you wanted to change the width, you say width, and then the value you want to change it to, right? So if we wanted to change the background color of div3, right, we need to select it, find it, and then do CSS, the property you want to change, and then the value you want to change it to. So let's do that. So we know that the thing we want to look for is div3, and then we want to change its CSS, and the property we want to change is background color. And you notice here, like when we do vanilla JavaScript, we have to camel case it because it's like a property. In this case, it's just a string, and jQuery interprets it, so it's just the full CSS property name. So these are the little differences, right, that are makes learning documentation required for understanding how to use it. And then we set the color to something like our favorite color, tomato. And let's see if that worked. Okay, it didn't work. I wonder if I spelled tomato wrong. All right, so div3 was not changed. So let's see here. Div3, okay, so I did not include the pound hashtag pound sign. Akatorp. All right, tomato. Right, so it immediately changed it as it loaded because the JavaScript was just in line and it just changed it immediately. So, you can change anything, right, with this. You could even string together, I think, multiple things. So you could say height to RVM. Makes it shorter, right? So you can chain these things together and make very detailed style changes based on jQuery. All right, and the last one is try to download a JSON file from an API using jQuery and set the value of a div with this page with something in the response, right? And so if you look at the code for this one, I already kind of got us started with a API provided. So basically we're using this dog.ceo API. Hopefully this still works. Let's give it a shot. So we can actually go to this URL and see if it does something. All right. So dog.ceo is providing us with a image and then a status. So this is JSON, right? It's giving us a little JSON message to an image, a link to an image of a dog, a random dog, each time you hit it. So using jQuery, let's load this JSON response and then do something with it. Obviously, we want to add an image of the dog somewhere to our page, right? So basically, there's a link to the documentation for it, but jQuery provides this .get method. And basically, this just simplifies doing API or kind of JSON work, requesting content. And so jQuery provides a lot of these kind of shortcuts. And so they give an example of how they use the shortcut. But this $, right, is just represents jQuery itself. And it's just saying, okay, get is built into jQuery. It's not built into any of the elements that we're searching for, right? Why would it wouldn't be built into a div. It's built into the library. So we say $.get and then the URL we want to get, and then we pass the data. And jQuery does nice things like turn the data response into JSON automatically, so we can work with it as a JSON object. So what we have doing right now is that it's just loading, and if we look at the console, it's console logging out the response from the API, right? Message and status. So if we change this to just log the message, right? It's just going to log the URL to the dog image. So we know we have a dog image stored there, right? So we're getting the jQuery.get, here's the URL to the API, and then here's the function that's being passed the data in this variable. And so we could maybe make an image element, right, and add it to the page. So let's create a new image element with jQuery. So we'll say image. All right, so we create a new image, and now we want to set the source attribute, right? And so we don't know how to do this with jQuery yet, so we search it. So we'd say jQuery set attribute, right? Because we know things like source and href, those are attributes on our HTML element. So we'll say, how do we use that with jQuery? And so here is a attr method defined. And so attr lets you set a element property. So all we need to know now is how to actually use it. So if we look for examples, there's some very elaborate examples here. So we can say you set attr, and the property you want to change, or the attribute you want to change, and then this value you want to change it to. So our attribute is src, the source for the image, and the value is the result of that message, right? So let's give it a shot. So now we have this image element. And so we're going to say image element dot attr. Let's see if this works. And we're going to change the source, and we're going to change the source to my data.message, right? That's the URL to the dog image. Let's just log that. Let's see if that works. All right, so this is what it logged. It does have a source attribute. So I think that worked. So let's give it a try. And the last thing we need to do, right, is add it to wherever we're adding it to, and we're adding it to our div4. So the first thing we need to do is select the div4, and then append the image. There is a dog. Right, and so we could, add some more things to this, right? So we could say image.css and change its width. We could say max width to, 250 or say 400 pixels, right? And these are strings, right? They're wrapped in quotes because they're px is a unit measure, so it's not a number, it's a unit, it's a pixel measurement. And so that's going to limit the big ones to just be a certain size. And if it's smaller than that, then it's just smaller, right? So hopefully this kind of demonstrates why you would use jQuery, and why folks even today use it. In the terms of more modern web development, things like reactive frameworks like React and Vue, Svelte, Angular, these are all more kind of modern day frameworks that people use to do JavaScript stuff. So we'll talk more about those in other lectures, but you'll still find jQuery is very ubiquitous, and lots of people still use it. And you can see why, because it's very easy to get started with, and it's very easy to get things done really quickly. And so one of the big things that folks use jQuery for is knowing when the page was finished loading. So this sounds like a stupid problem, but it was really difficult to kind of get things working. So if you have JavaScript that's going to interact with the DOM, as we've seen before, you have to make sure that JavaScript is below the elements, right? So when the browser is rendering it from the top to bottom, it renders the DOM elements, and then it does the JavaScript that's referencing those elements. And so if you think about where you want to put your code, that gets really difficult, because if you have your code in an external file and it's very complicated, you have lots of stuff in there, you want to make sure the DOM elements are actually there before you start executing stuff. And so one of the ways that lots of folks got around this is basically waiting for an event to happen to say that the DOM is done loading, right? So for example, say I wanted to put this code that I have here that's loading this image of this dog from the API into the element. Say I want to put this in an external file, because I'm going to use this multiple times. So I'm going to put it in our external JavaScript file here. All right. So if I put this in my external JavaScript file, and I go to my header, and I include it, right? I'm going to include script.js. Let's see what happens. All right, so it works a little bit. And I think it works because there's like a slight delay in the making the requests and then it actually doing it. So I think if this API was a little bit quicker, it would try to add it to the div without it being loaded yet. So let's see if we can make it just kind of simulate that here. So let's in our external file here, let's comment this out, right? Because I think we're getting lucky and it's making this request, and in the time that this request is being sent, the DOM is actually loaded very quickly, and then it's there for it to work once it gets to this code. Let's say we had some code out here where we're saying, let's set the content of, or the text of div 4 to something. Should not work. Okay, so immediately it's there and it's gonna try to set the div 4 text to something. And so let's comment this out here. So commenting out the API. And so you can see that it is not working, right? So when I load the page, this is not being changed to the text that I want it to be set to, that I'm putting in my external JavaScript text here, right? So if I put this back into the page, and I put it at the bottom below, then it works, right? This should work because the div is there and it's able to change this content. But when I have it in my external file and it loads this first, right, in the head of the page, and it tries to implement this command. It says, okay, find the div 4 and change its text. It doesn't work. It doesn't happen, right? It's not successful. So it just fails, right? So this doesn't change. So this was a big problem, right? Because if you have very elaborate JavaScript going on that depends on it working, right? It depends on the DOM elements actually being there, then you run into a big problem where if it's not there, it's going to break a whole lot of stuff. So in jQuery was very useful in providing a way of doing this because you can basically wrap this code in a event listener. And so you could say document ready, and then do something. And so basically, you could put your code inside of this document ready, and it would, oh, I'm sorry, yeah. All right, so you should see, yeah. So you should see document ready, and you should see, any code you put in here would only execute once the DOM has been loaded and everything is ready to go. So now if we try this, we can see that it's waiting for it to happen and then it updates it, right? We should say it should work actually. So jQuery provided that ability to kind of really control the flow of your script and really only invoke things when you know for sure the page is done loading. Nowadays, you can actually accomplish the same thing using vanilla JavaScript by using event listeners. So you could say document add event listener. We'll say it's called DOM content loaded, and then you do a function. And then we could put in our function. This should work. All right. So we can see it like changing, right, pretty quickly. So this is an example of, why jQuery was really useful and very important, because that was a really complicated thing to know when the DOM was finished loading, and it was implemented in a lot of different ways across many different browsers. So being able to know in one place when the DOM is ready was like a simple but very kind of complicated thing. And so, there's other sites, or there's a site that kind of like gets into this where it's like, you might not need jQuery. It's a little kind of tongue in cheek, but it basically shows you how you do something in jQuery and then how you would do it in vanilla JavaScript. And so, for example, if you needed to support Internet Explorer 10 plus, then this was how you do a JSON request in that, right? In our previous examples, we use fetch, which is like super modern. And so if you had to support IE10, it wouldn't work, right? So it goes through all these different ways of doing something in jQuery and then how you do it in vanilla JavaScript. And so, the point is that you might not need to include jQuery in your project if you were just doing something simple like this, and you could just do it in vanilla JavaScript. But again, sometimes that decision is already made for you. You might be working on a project, or you might be using a template or something that already has jQuery built in. So if it's already there, why not use it? And hopefully this kind of gives you some heads up on how to start using it. All right. So that's one library, right, of infinity, but it's a very popular one. So another thing we'll be looking at will be more different libraries and how to implement them. Starting with, we're going to try to do a D3 JavaScript library next. All right, so if we want to move on into another library, we can try to get something like a D3, which is a data visualization library working. And so I've often found that to kind of get kind of situated with a library, a JavaScript library, it's kind of best just to start off with some examples and then see if you can modify them and then go from there. But of course, there's a lot of kind of like caveats and stuff like that. So we're going to try to just kind of do a basic D3 data visualization, starting with an example and then seeing how far we can get and modify it to our purposes. So we have a glitch here, which is just basically the same glitch that we had back in a couple lectures ago when we were working with APIs. It basically talks to the city bike, New York City city bike API to get some kind of availability statistics for the bikes in this current system, the city bikes in the current system and docs there. So what we can do, right, is we made this little progress bar, and this was a pure HTML CSS thing. And so we could say, like, well, maybe we could add a data visualization component to this, right? Maybe we could add a little something awful like a pie chart or something like that, right? And so we know that, from experience, this is just kind of being around and understanding how websites work and the kind of current state of things, that D3 is a pretty popular visualization library. And, folks, use D3 all the time to make stuff. It's very complicated, but it's very kind of highly customizable. So there is you can start off by doing a lot of tutorials and stuff like that. But for us, we're just gonna kind of find an example that matches what we want to do, and then we'll try to modify it just to see if we can get it working, right? And so I basically just searched D3 pie chart and came across this example of a D3 pie chart. And so what you want to do when you start working with these kind of examples is you want to just see if you can get the base example working, and then if you can, then start modifying it to do what you want to do. And so, for example, this one is saying, all right, so you can load the D3 module and then create a div for the visualization to live in, and then here's all the D3 code, and we'll go through that. So the first thing you want to do, though, is get the library installed on your site, right? This is what we've been doing. And so here is our site. And here's our city bytecode that we used from last lecture. And so what we want to do is get the D3 library loaded. And so what's you want to be careful is when you work with libraries now is that there is this idea of versioning, right? And so a version of a library is released at a certain point in time, and it might change in the future, right? So of course, the very first release of D3 is not the same as the current release, right? They made a lot of changes to it. There's changes to the API, there's changes to how it works. There's just many changes. So you want to make sure that the one that you're going to use is matching up to the one that you are going to do an example with that you're pulling from, right? So if I go to the D3 site now, they say they have a CDN available here, and you can use it by just including this in your script, in your head of your page to use D3, and you'll notice here it says version 6. So if we go to our example that we're about to pull from, we can see it says it's using version 4. So of course, that's 2 major versions difference between this code. And so you'd say, well, I want to use the latest version of D3 because, it might be better, it might be faster, etc. But I don't know if it's compatible, right? So before you do that, let's just try to get this version of this example working, right? So we know that we want to use D3, so we're going to copy the version 4 that they're including in their script and put that in ours. Right? And then we know that we need to create a div where the visualization is going to live. So I'll put that at the bottom of the page. And then we have all this code, right? So let's put this in our page. All right, so hopefully if we looked at the site, it would have this demo pie chart loaded with these wonderful colors, right? So it loaded, right? So it actually worked. This is on our site, so we know it worked. So we can start saying like, well, what if we bump the version of the D3 script to version 5? Let's see if it still works. Right, yep, it's still there, it still loads. And then let's say, okay, we know version 6 is the latest, so let's bump the version to version 6 and see what happens. And it does not work, right? It's broken. And so, you can go into your console here and see that there's maybe some errors, maybe no errors, but it just failed to load, right? There's some errors, yeah. All right, so this is not really an error that we can fix, right? We'd have to know a whole lot about the D3, how this example is using it, and then stuff like that. So it seems to work with 5, so we're just going to stick with 5 and then go from there, right? All right, so we have a chart loaded now. So we want to basically make this a 2-piece pie chart, right? One that has the availability and one that has the not available, right? So we need to start looking at the code for the pie chart. So even if we know nothing about D3, right, we can walk through this code and kind of understand the different pieces of it, right? So sets the dimensions, right? So that's how big the pie chart's going to be, and we're assuming that this would be in pixels, right? The radius of the pie plot is half the width of the height of the size of the visualization, right? So it's basically defining the radius of the pie chart, and it's taking these defined up there and divided by 2, and then it's adding a little margin on the side. That makes sense? All right, so now we start getting into more D3 based stuff, right? So saying the SVG is equal to the D3 select. We have no idea what that does, but it's selecting, we know that that is our div, right, that we created. And it looks like it's appending an SVG, so we kind of know what append means from like the jQuery days we were looking at earlier. It's appending a G, and we know if we know some SVG stuff, this is all SVG elements, and then it's adding a transform. So it's basically creating a SVG element for us, right, and storing that here. So we know nothing about D3, how it works, but we know that it's creating SVG element. And then it says create dummy data, right? Okay, so here's probably where we put our hooks into it, right? We can actually put our own data in there instead of this dummy data. And then it's saying, okay, set the color scales. So it's defining some colors that we might want to customize data. So basically it looks like D3 is taking this data and it's combining it to what colors are available for each one of these values. View the position of each group. So saying D3 pi, this looks like D3 stuff, we don't need to modify. And it says build a bar chart. And it's basically going in there and building this radius, adding SVG elements and setting occupancy and stroke width and stuff like that. So we don't know anything about D3, right? We could spend all the time reading the manual and doing tutorials, but we kind of get a feel of what this visualization is doing, right? And which each piece of it's doing. So we can go ahead and try to figure out how to add our data into it, right? So if we go back to our data, we come up with this percent available, right? And this is a number, which is like the 44%, right? So we know 44%. So the other half of that would be 100 minus 44, right? Would be unavailable. So we know that we have this piece of data, 44, so that would be 1, and the other one would be the not available, right? So we could even do that right now. We can say bar average percent not available. 100 minus. Right, so now we have a number for that too. So the thing we need to know or think about is where do we put this code, right? So right now it's in its own place, in its own little area here. But if we want this code to interact with our code up here, we have to put it with each other, right? We know that this is working on the City Bike API, so we have to put the code in the response to the API. We can't put it down here because this would run immediately and there's no results yet, so it won't be able to build the pie chart with no data because it hasn't done that API work yet. So what we can do is come in here and cut all this out, right? We'll copy it, cut it, get rid of this script tag, and we'll put it up here at the bottom of our API stuff. So now we know this code is inside the API call, so it will work because the code will be available once the data is available, right? So now we have our dummy data here. So we can start playing with it, right? So we know we're gonna have 2 values. So what happens if we delete most of these values except 2? See what happens. So it still works, right? So if that still works, then we just need to replace these pieces of data with our data, right? So let's replace it with average percent available. With average percent not available. Right, so we replace those 2 values with our own data now, and let's take a look. Right, so that looks more like 44%, and the remainder of the bikes available, not available. So we could go ahead and colorize this, right, to make the one blue. Let's see if it takes words. Yeah. So it's not a very sophisticated pie chart, but it is a pie chart and it's using D3. And so the idea is basically find an example that you would fit your purposes, right? And then start tinkering with the different pieces of it. And make sure you test a lot, right? Always test it. Always make sure every little change you make, does it still work? Is it still going? Always double check stuff, right? We can delete these if you want to be clean here. And so basically, my next thing would be like, well, this is pretty not very communicative, right? So I probably want to add some labels or something like that. So I go look for an example where it adds labels and then start modifying that, right? And so this is a good way to kind of, if you think about getting used to or getting started with these different JavaScript libraries that you want to do, is find an example that kind of conveys what you want to do and just start manipulating it and playing around with it. And then go check the documentation if you need to and come back and etc. Right? So it's like a really iterative process, just starting with something simple and then building out from there to get going. So that's another library that we could do, that we've done. And so what we can do also is maybe even try a different library, right? A different visualization library. So, there's all sorts of different libraries that you could get into depending on the functionality, what you want to do. Another data visualization library that's pretty popular is Charts.js, which is a library that exists on top of D3. So I believe it uses D3 as its lower level calls, and then kind of abstracts it and makes it a little bit more enjoyable to use, a little simpler to use. So let's do this from the same process, right? Let's reuse the same data. So we're going to use the same city bike API. And let's just look up Chart.js and find an example. All right, Chart.js. All right, so we'd say, all right, let's look at some samples. And let's do a donut this time instead of a pie chart. All right, so they have some interactive examples here, and this is a little bit nicer, right? There's a legend already, and there's various hover effects. These are just like add data and stuff like that. So what we do is, right, we're going to view the source and start looking at this code that they have in here. All right. So it looks like there's a config thing, and it's creating a bunch of random data, right? And it picks a bunch of background colors. It has a bunch of labels, and it has a bunch of options for being things like, should it be responsive? Should it be, where should the legend go? Do you want to use animations, titles, text, etc.? Then it has basically Windows on load. It's loading some stuff. And then it looks like this is all the buttons at the bottom, right? Where it's like you can add and remove data, right? To demonstrate that it's animation, has capabilities. All right. So first thing we do, right, is let's just get the base example working. So let's look how they included their JavaScript, their library. So here they're linking to a relative path, right? So it's it's in a certain distribution. So what we want to do is figure out how to download Chart.js to begin with, right? So let's go in here and say get started. And then here's a little introductory if you want to do that. So we'll go to installation tab here. And so you often see this npm and bower, etc., right? So npm is basically if you're building using npm, which is a command line module or library manager, you can install it that way. But they also offer a CDN here. So let's just use their CDN. Right. So we want to use this URL or the CDN. It's using Cloudflare. It sounds great. So if we go to that, it would just be the code for the Chart.js, and you notice it's a minified version of it. That's just fine. So let's go back to our project, and we're going to add in, we'll just leave the D3 stuff there too. And we're going to add in our Chart.js. Right? So now that's included. Now let's try to get the base example working here. And so we know we have these, there's a div, there's a chart area, and then all this stuff. So let's just copy all this. And let's just see if we can get that script working, right? Just what they have there working. So let's put this at the bottom of our page. So it doesn't work, right? So let's look at the console and see if there's any errors. There was an error. So it says something about the color red. And it's something about chart colors and stuff like that. So we go back to this example and make sure. It looks like they're also loading this utilities thing, right? In this line here. So maybe that has this color information, right? So we know this is the problem. So maybe we'd want to include that somehow. Another option is, it looks like this is like a little library just for the examples. So another option would be like just to maybe just hard code some colors in there for our version of it. So let's say, here's the background colors. So this is red, so let's just do red. Let's see if this works. Yeah, right? All right, so now we have colors, and even this stuff should work. No, it doesn't. Yeah, it does. A little bit. Kind of working. All right, so, but we got it to render, right? That's an important thing. And so now we can go in and customize this chart so it fits our purposes, right? So we know, first off, we don't want all these buttons, right? Because this is not a dynamic example. This is just our data views that we're doing. So we'll go in here and find where all those buttons are in HTML. Let's just delete those, right? And then we also probably don't want all these buttons, get element stuff, right? To randomize the data, add data set, all this stuff, right? We're just going to cut all the stuff out because these were just for the buttons at the bottom for the demo. All right. So this is still works. So keep tracking if it still works, etc. The next thing we can do is now we want to kind of shoehorn our data into this example. So we know from the previous D3 example, this has to live with the other API results, the data set that comes back. So let's take all the script and we'll cut that out and put it up here inside of this API results. All right, so now we can modify it more because it's applying some random data, right? So it has this like random data that's being generated. And so we don't have random data, so we don't delete that. And then we'll delete the references to it. We really only have two pieces of data, right? We have the percent available, and we have the percent not available. That's our two pieces of data. And then our background colors, we don't really need all these colors. We just need red and blue again. Or maybe blue and red, right? Because that's and then the labels will be available. And not available. All right, so then we don't need these other pieces here. And so let's see if this renders, right? Oh, and I spelled available very wrong. But you can see that it actually is rendering, right? And it has this hover. We might want to go in and make those percent signs or those floating point numbers smaller, right? And you could go into read the documentation for Chart.js and see like, well, what are some of the other configuration things we can change, right? What does it mean to make it responsive or not responsive? What if I set this to false? Add a title, etc. Right? So the important thing is like to get the example working, and then you can start going from there and modifying it to how you want to do it. But you can notice like, just because this library is a little bit different and it's a little bit more ready to go, you have like a little bit more nicer functionality of this visualization, right? There's hover, there's shading, charts, there's titles, legends. So, and this Chart.js site offers a bunch of different examples, right? You can just get started with various types of visualizations and start modifying them based on that. But this is kind of like the process, right? Finding an example you want to start working with, and then start going from there and modifying it to see how far you can get. So there's a lot more, libraries out there that can be very useful to use, and very kind of have different approaches in how you have to implement them and how you actually add them to your project and start working with them. But hopefully this gives you some ideas on how to get started, and you can start playing around with whatever libraries that you come across. And a good way, just discovering a library is just Google, saying JavaScript library, and then what you want to do, right? So if you're looking for like a scroll event listener library, you say like JavaScript libraries, scroll events, and stuff like that, and then see what comes up and see how easy or difficult it is to implement those libraries. But hopefully this will get you started, and we'll talk more about this. And thanks for watching, and talk to you later. Bye.